If you've ever watched someone be judged by their appearance before anyone bothered to know who they were, if you've ever seen assumptions crumble when the truth comes to light, then you understand that dignity doesn't demand recognition. It simply exists, waiting to be acknowledged. This channel tells the stories that remind us how easily we misjudge, how quickly we assume, and how powerfully truth can shift everything in a single moment. If these stories resonate with you, if you believe that everyone deserves to be seen beyond surface judgments, consider subscribing. You're part of a community that looks deeper. Amara stood in the security line at Washington Dulles International Airport, her worn canvas backpack slung over one shoulder. She wore simple clothes, faded jeans, a plain grey sweatshirt, comfortable sneakers that had seen better days. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, no jewelry, no makeup, nothing that would draw attention or suggest she was anything other than an ordinary traveler making her way through the endless routine of modern air travel. The line moved slowly, as it always did. Families with restless children shifted their weight from foot to foot, parents juggling bags and strollers and sippy cups. Business travelers checked their watches impatiently, already calculating whether they'd make their flights. Tourists fumbled with boarding passes and identification, confused by the ever-changing requirements and procedures. Amara waited her turn patiently, her expression neutral, her posture relaxed. She'd been through this process hundreds of times in dozens of airports across 6 continents. She knew the rhythm, the expectations, the unspoken rules of airport security. She'd learned long ago that how you dressed mattered in airports. Not because of actual security, her credentials would speak for themselves once examined properly, but because of perception. Expensive clothes drew attention. Designer luggage invited assumptions about wealth and entitlement. She preferred to travel simply, to blend in, to be just another face in the anonymous crowds that flowed through international terminals. When she reached the document check, she handed over her passport and boarding pass to the TSA officer, a middle-aged man with a tired expression and the mechanical movements of someone who'd checked thousands of documents that day alone. He glanced at her passport photo, then at her face, then back at the passport. His expression didn't change. He scanned the document, waited for the system to respond, then waved her through to the security screening area without really looking at her, without noticing the designation printed on the second page. Amara collected her passport and moved to the next station. Placing her backpack on the conveyor belt, she removed her sneakers, placed them in a grey bin, pulled her laptop from her bag, and placed it in a separate bin as required. She removed her watch, a simple Timex, nothing expensive, and her belt. The routine was so familiar it required no thought. She'd done this in dozens of airports across dozens of countries. Dulles was no different from Heathrow or Charles de Gaulle or Nairobi's Jomo Kenyatta. The security theatre was universal, performed with minor variations, but the same essential script. She walked through the metal detector without incident. No beep, no alert. She stepped aside and waited for her belongings to emerge from the X-ray machine, already mentally preparing for the next phase of her journey, finding her gate, reviewing her briefing materials, perhaps grabbing coffee if time permitted. Other travelers moved around her, some rushing with the frantic energy of people who'd cut their timing too close, others moving with the same patient familiarity she felt. She watched a young mother struggle to reassemble a stroller while holding a crying infant, watched a businessman bark into his phone about a missed meeting, watched an elderly couple help each other put their shoes back on with the careful deliberation of people for whom bending down had become difficult. Then she noticed the TSA officer monitoring the X-ray screen pause. He leaned forward slightly, studying something on the monitor. His hand moved to adjust the image, zooming in on whatever had caught his attention. He called over a supervisor, a woman in her 50s with grey hair pulled back severely and an expression that suggested she'd seen every possible attempt at deception and had been impressed by none of them. They spoke in low voices, both looking at the screen, then at Amara's belongings as they emerged from the machine. The supervisor walked over to where Amara stood, her body language radiating authority and suspicion in equal measure. "Ma'am, we need to do a secondary inspection of your bag." Amara nodded calmly. "Of course." The supervisor pulled Amara's backpack aside to a stainless steel inspection table positioned in full view of the security line. Another TSA officer joined them, a younger man, perhaps in his late 20s, with a sharp, suspicious expression and the zealous energy of someone still new enough to the job to take it personally. The three of them stood around her bag like it contained evidence of a crime, like she was a suspect and they were investigators closing in on crucial proof. "Is this your bag, ma'am?" the supervisor asked, though she'd just watched Amara claim it moments earlier. "Yes." "Did you pack it yourself?" "Yes." "Has it been in your possession the entire time since you packed it?" "Yes." The supervisor unzipped the main compartment with exaggerated care, as if expecting something dangerous to spring out. Amara watched without concern. She knew exactly what was in her bag: clothes, toiletries, a book, her laptop, charging cables, fair folder of documents she'd need for meetings. Nothing unusual, nothing prohibited, nothing that should trigger this level of scrutiny. But the supervisor was pulling items out methodically, examining each one with theatrical thoroughness, clearly designed to project authority to the watching crowd. A worn paperback thriller, John le Carré, The Constant Gardener, about corruption and pharmaceutical companies in Africa. The supervisor flipped through it as if secret messages might be encoded in the margins. A small toiletry bag, containing travel-sized containers that met all the liquid requirements. Amara had learned long ago to keep everything regulation compliant to avoid exactly this kind of hassle. Her change of clothes rolled efficiently to save space, an extra pair of shoes, a light jacket. The supervisor set each item on the table, creating a display of Amara's possessions for anyone passing by to see. Other travelers slowed as they passed, watching the inspection with the mixture of curiosity and relief that comes from being the observer rather than the subject of security theater. Some glanced at Amara with expressions that ranged from sympathy to suspicion, making their own assumptions about why this particular traveler was being singled out. Young woman, brown skin, simple clothes, being searched by security. The assumptions wrote themselves in their eyes, their quick glances, their whispered comments to their companions. The younger TSA officer picked up Amara's toiletry bag and opened it, examining the contents with unnecessary thoroughness that bordered on invasive. He held up each item, a small bottle of face moisturizer, checking the volume printed on the label against the regulations he'd presumably memorized. 3.4 ounces, exactly at the limit. He seemed almost disappointed. A travel toothbrush, a small container of aspirin, lip balm, contact lens solution in a TSA-approved bottle. Everything by the book, everything compliant. He set each item down with slightly more force than necessary, his frustration at finding nothing wrong evident in his movements. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to swab your bag for explosive residue," the supervisor said, her tone making it clear this wasn't a request, but an announcement of what would happen regardless of Amara's preferences. "Go ahead," Amara said evenly, her voice betraying none of the weary frustration she felt. She'd been through this before. Not every time she flew, but often enough that it felt like a predictable pattern rather than random selection. Young, black, female, traveling alone, dressed casually. Some combination of these factors regularly triggered additional scrutiny, regardless of the fact that she'd never once been found with anything remotely suspicious. The supervisor ran chemical detection swabs over the interior and exterior of the backpack, with deliberate slowness, making a show of being thorough. She swabbed the zippers, the straps, the bottom of the bag. She inserted each swab into a trace detection machine and waited while it analyzed the samples. The three TSA officers stood watching Amara as the machine worked, their eyes moving between her face and the machine's display, waiting for it to reveal the threat they seemed certain must be there. Other travelers continued to slow and stare as they passed, the inspection drawing attention, like an accident on a highway, something potentially disturbing that people couldn't help but look at. Amara heard whispers, saw pointing, felt the weight of judgment from strangers who knew nothing about her, but felt entitled to opinions about her based on this moment of scrutiny. A woman in expensive activewear leaned over to her companion and whispered something, and both of them looked at Amara with expressions of concern mixed with satisfaction. The relief of seeing security taking threats seriously combined with the unexamined assumption that the young black woman being searched must have done something to deserve it. Amara stood calmly, her hands at her sides, her expression neutral. She'd learned this composure over years of navigating spaces where she was presumed not to belong until she proved otherwise. She'd been stopped and questioned entering high-end stores. She'd been asked for additional identification when checking into hotels where she had reservations. She'd been treated with suspicion in 100 small ways by people who looked at her and saw someone who didn't fit their mental image of who belonged in certain spaces. She'd been through worse than this. She'd been through checkpoints in countries where security meant armed soldiers and genuine danger, rather than this performance of safety. She'd been detained at borders, questioned by officials whose suspicion was backed by actual weapons and actual power to deny her passage. She could wait through this with the same patience she'd developed navigating more serious obstacles. The machine beeped. The supervisor checked the results on the small display screen. Nothing, no trace of explosives, no prohibited materials, no reason for concern. The younger officer leaned over to look at the screen himself, as if doubting the result, as if certain the machine must have malfunctioned because his instincts told him there must be something wrong. But instead of apologizing and allowing Amara to repack her belongings and continue to her gate, the supervisor exchanged a glance with the younger officer. Some unspoken communication passed between them, a decision made without words, a choice to continue the scrutiny despite the absence of any evidence justifying it. "We're going to need to do a pat-down," the supervisor announced. "Here?" Amara asked quietly, though she already knew the answer. She'd been through this too. "We have a private screening room if you prefer." "I prefer to get to my gate," Amara said, her tone still even but with an edge now that suggested she understood exactly what was happening and why. "Here is fine." Another female TSA officer was called over for the pat-down. She wore latex gloves and an expression of professional detachment that suggested she'd performed this procedure so many times it had become completely routine. She explained the procedure in a monotone, where she would touch, how Amara should stand, what to expect. Amara nodded, already knowing. She'd heard this speech before in other airports, other security lines, other moments of being singled out. The pat-down was thorough and impersonal, conducted with the mechanical efficiency of a routine that had been performed thousands of times. The officer's hands moved over Amara's body in the prescribed pattern, checking for weapons or contraband that might be concealed under her simple clothes. Other travelers continued to stare as they passed. Amara could feel their eyes on her, could sense their judgments forming like chemical reactions, assumptions about who she must be and what she must have done to warrant this level of security attention. She saw a teenage girl watching with wide eyes, saw the girl's mother pull her along quickly, as if Amara's potential criminality might be contagious. She saw a businessman in an expensive suit shake his head in a way that suggested either disapproval of the security measures or satisfaction that threats were being taken seriously. She couldn't tell which, and wasn't sure it mattered. When the pat-down revealed nothing, no weapons, no contraband, no reason whatsoever for concern, the TSA officers finally stepped back. The female officer removed her gloves and disposed of them in a nearby trash can, the gesture somehow feeling like a judgment in itself, as if Amara had contaminated the gloves simply by being touched. The supervisor began repacking Amara's belongings into her backpack with none of the care that Amara had used to pack them originally. The efficient rolls of clothing were now just stuffed in loosely, wrinkled and disorganized. The toiletry bag was tossed on top rather than placed carefully. The book was bent at the corner. The laptop was shoved in without the protective sleeve Amara kept it in. Everything that had been organized was now chaos. "You're clear to go," the supervisor said, her tone suggesting this was a generous act rather than the conclusion of an unjustified detention that should never have happened in the first place. Amara took her backpack, noticing that her passport and boarding pass had been set aside on the inspection table rather than returned to her immediately. She reached for them, and that's when everything changed. The younger TSA officer, who had been putting away the inspection equipment, happened to glance at the passport lying open on the table. His hand froze mid-motion. His eyes widened slightly as he processed what he was seeing. He picked up the passport and looked at it more carefully, his expression shifting from suspicion to confusion to something approaching alarm. He looked at Amara, then back at the passport, then at Amara again, as if trying to reconcile what the document said with the person standing before him. Supervisor?" he said, his voice suddenly uncertain, the confident authority of moments before evaporating into nervous confusion. The supervisor, who had already turned to deal with another traveler whose bag was coming through the X-ray machine, turned back with an impatient expression. "What?" The younger officer held up the passport, pointing at something on one of the inner pages. The supervisor took it, her expression shifting from impatience to confusion to something approaching alarm as she read what the younger officer had seen. She looked at Amara with new eyes, eyes that were now uncertain, calculating, trying to figure out how to handle a situation that had suddenly become much more complicated than a routine security check. "Ma'am, I need to verify something. Can you wait here for a moment?" It wasn't really a question. It was a command phrased politely to avoid the appearance of the detention it actually was. Amara nodded and waited, while the supervisor walked quickly to a desk phone mounted on the wall nearby. She made a call, speaking in tones too low for Amara to hear, though her body language suggested urgency and concern, and a need to escalate this situation to someone with more authority to handle it. The other TSA officers had stopped what they were doing. They were looking at Amara differently now, though they clearly didn't understand why yet. The younger officer who'd discovered whatever was in the passport kept glancing between Amara and the supervisor on the phone, his expression suggesting he'd just made a significant mistake and was beginning to realize it. Other travelers in line were watching with renewed interest, sensing that something unusual was happening. The routine security theater had become something else, though none of them knew what. The supervisor returned after what felt like several minutes, but was probably less than one. She handed Amara her passport without meeting her eyes directly, a subtle shift in body language that suggested the power dynamic had completely reversed. "I apologize for the delay, ma'am. You're free to go." But Amara could see it in their faces. They'd seen something in her passport that had changed everything, and now they didn't know how to handle the fact that they'd just subjected her to an unnecessary and invasive search. They didn't know how to reconcile the assumptions they'd made about her based on her appearance with whatever the passport had revealed about who she actually was. "What did you see?" Amara asked quietly, though she already knew. She'd seen this reaction before, though usually it happened at the first document check rather than after a full search. The supervisor hesitated, clearly uncertain how much to say, how much to acknowledge. "Your passport indicates certain diplomatic privileges. We should have noticed earlier during the initial document check. We apologize for any inconvenience." The word inconvenience was so inadequate for what had just happened that Amara almost laughed. But she didn't. She simply picked up her passport and boarding pass, taking a moment to look at the page that had caused such a dramatic shift in their behavior. There, clearly printed on the second page, was her diplomatic designation. Diplomatic passport, special envoy status, ambassador for human rights and humanitarian affairs, Federal Republic of Nigeria. She could have said many things in that moment. She could have pointed out the profiling, the assumptions, the way they'd treated her like a criminal based on nothing but her appearance. She could have noted that diplomatic status shouldn't be what determined whether she was treated with dignity, that common humanity should be enough. She could have demanded to speak to their supervisor's supervisor, could have filed a formal complaint, could have made this a moment of confrontation and consequence. Instead, she simply said, "Thank you," and walked toward her gate, leaving the TSA officers standing in awkward silence, realizing what they'd done, and beginning to understand the potential consequences of having detained and searched a foreign ambassador without cause. But as she walked away, she heard the younger officer whisper to the supervisor, with barely concealed panic in his voice, "What did her passport say? Who is she?" And the supervisor's response, barely audible but weighted with concern, "Diplomatic passport, special envoy designation, ambassador level. She represents Nigeria at the UN. The rest was lost as Amara moved out of earshot, But the tone had shifted from authority to anxiety, from certainty to fear of repercussions. Amara made her way through the terminal, finding her gate with time to spare despite the delay. She sat in a quiet corner away from the crowds, away from the families and business travelers and the endless noise of airport announcements. She pulled out her phone and saw several missed messages from her office. One from her deputy chief of staff. Landing confirmed, Geneva side, hotel arranged. Need anything from DC before you depart? Another from her communications director. Ambassador, CNN wants interview about upcoming HRC session. Can we schedule for tomorrow morning before your flight? And one from her assistant. TSA liaison called. Incident at security. Do we need to address? So it had already been escalated. Someone at TSA had realized the diplomatic implications quickly enough to reach out to her office, probably trying to get ahead of any formal complaint. Amara considered her response. She could make this an international incident if she wanted. Diplomatic immunity violations, even minor procedural ones, could become significant diplomatic issues if the aggrieved party chose to pursue them. But what would that accomplish? The officers would be reprimanded, perhaps retrained. The procedures might be reviewed, and then everything would continue exactly as before, because the problem wasn't procedures, it was assumptions. It was the way people looked at her and saw someone who didn't belong in certain spaces, someone who needed to prove her legitimacy, someone whose dignity was contingent on credentials rather than inherent. She drafted a brief response to her assistant. Minor delay at security. No action needed. See you tomorrow. She sent it and put her phone away, pulling out her battered paperback instead. The book was a simple thriller, nothing profound, just a way to pass time between meetings and flights and the endless obligations of her position. But she found it hard to focus on the words. The encounter at security kept replaying in her mind, not because it had been particularly traumatic or even unusual in her experience, but because of what it represented. How many times had she been judged by her appearance? How many times had people made assumptions about who she was, what she was capable of, where she belonged? She thought about the TSA officers' faces when they'd realized their mistake, the shock, the embarrassment, the sudden uncertainty about how to handle someone they'd been treating as a potential threat moments before. She wondered if they would learn anything from the experience, if they would question their own assumptions the next time they saw someone who looked like her in the security line. Probably not, she thought. People rarely learned from embarrassment alone. They learned from consequences, and there would be no real consequences for those officers beyond a few uncomfortable moments and perhaps a notation in their files that would be forgotten within weeks. The gate area began to fill as boarding time approached. Amara noticed people glancing at her occasionally. The young woman in worn jeans reading a paperback thriller, taking up space in the priority boarding area despite her appearance, suggesting she should be in basic economy with everyone else. She saw a woman in expensive business attire look at her with barely concealed annoyance, as if Amara's presence in the priority area was somehow offensive. She saw a man in a suit glance at her shoes, worn sneakers rather than professional footwear, and then look away with an expression of disapproval. Let them judge, Amara thought. Let them make their assumptions. The truth would reveal itself soon enough. When the gate agent announced pre-boarding for passengers needing assistance, followed by first-class and premium cabin passengers, Amara remained seated. She waited through the announcement for priority boarding Group 1, then Group 2. Only when they called for diplomatic passport holders, a category that usually went unmentioned, but was technically part of the priority boarding sequence, did she stand and join the line. The gate agent, a young woman with a practiced smile and tired eyes, scanned Amara's boarding pass and glanced at her passport. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw the diplomatic designation, but she recovered quickly and professionally. "Welcome aboard, Ms. A." She glanced at the name more carefully. "Ambassador Okonkwo, we hope you have a pleasant flight." Amara nodded her thanks and walked down the jet bridge. Behind her she heard whispers from other passengers who'd been close enough to hear the gate agent's greeting. "Ambassador? That young woman in the old jeans and sweatshirt? That's an ambassador?" She could imagine their confusion, their attempts to reconcile what they'd assumed about her with what they'd just learned. Some would probably dismiss it. Maybe she was just staff for an ambassador, they'd tell themselves. Maybe the gate agent made a mistake. People generally preferred their assumptions to remain unchallenged. She found her seat in business class, a window seat that would allow her to work or rest without disturbance during the transatlantic flight to Geneva. As she settled in, stowing her backpack under the seat in front of her, after reorganizing the contents that TSA had jumbled, she noticed the flight attendant approaching with a subtle change in demeanor that suggested the crew had been notified about her presence on the flight. "Ambassador Okonkwo, welcome aboard. I'm Sarah, the lead flight attendant for this cabin. Please let us know if you need anything during the flight. We're honored to have you with us." "Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate it." As other passengers boarded, filing past her seat to reach economy, Amara could feel their eyes on her. Some looked curious. How did that young woman end up in business class? Some looked skeptical, as if her presence there was somehow fraudulent or unearned. Some looked away quickly when she met their gaze, embarrassed to be caught staring. One elderly woman paused as she passed and said in a voice just loud enough to be heard, "Good for you, dear," in a tone that suggested either genuine admiration or patronizing surprise. Amara couldn't tell which and chose not to care. She pulled out her laptop and opened a briefing document for the meetings she'd be attending in Geneva. The UN Human Rights Council was in session, and she'd be delivering remarks on behalf of her country regarding humanitarian crises in 3 different regions. The speeches had been drafted by her staff, but she'd been revising them throughout the previous week, trying to find language that would thread the diplomatic needle, strong enough to make a point, careful enough not to trigger a diplomatic incident. A businessman in an expensive suit took the seat across the aisle from her. Mid-50s, graying hair, perfectly pressed clothes, leather briefcase that probably cost more than Amara's entire wardrobe. He glanced over, did a double take when he saw her laptop screen displayed a document marked "Confidential Diplomatic Briefing, Human Rights Council Session," and quickly looked away, his expression suggesting he was recalculating his assumptions about his fellow business class passengers. The flight attendant returned with pre-departure beverages, a small luxury that airlines extended to premium cabin passengers to justify the ticket price. "May I offer you a drink before takeoff, Ambassador?" "Water would be perfect, thank you." The businessman across the aisle, who had not been addressed by title, ordered a scotch with visible tension in his voice, as if trying to reassert some sense of status after being outranked by someone he'd clearly misjudged based on her appearance. As the plane pushed back from the gate and began its taxi to the runway, Amara closed her laptop and looked out the window. The sun was setting over the airport, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her of sunsets in Lagos, the city where she'd been born and where her parents still lived in the same modest house where she'd grown up. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, not just the car ride to the airport or the security checkpoint encounter, but the longer journey, the decades of work, the education fought for against skepticism and financial hardship, the endless proving of herself in rooms where people looked at her and saw someone who didn't belong. She'd been born in a small village outside Lagos, the youngest of 6 children. Her father had been a teacher at the local primary school, earning a salary that barely supported the family. Her mother had been a nurse at a rural clinic, working long hours for even less pay. Neither had traveled beyond Nigeria's borders, yet they'd instilled in their children a belief that the world was bigger than their village and that education was the key to accessing it. Amara had been the one who took that belief furthest. She'd been the brightest student in her village school, then in the secondary school in Lagos, where she'd won a scholarship. More scholarships had carried her from Lagos to London for university, where she'd studied international relations while working part-time jobs to supplement the scholarship money that covered tuition but barely touched living expenses. She'd cleaned offices in the evenings, served coffee in the mornings, tutored other students on weekends, anything to stay financially afloat while pursuing an education that everyone in her family recognized as the pathway to something better. She'd graduated top of her class and won a place at Harvard for graduate school, another scholarship that came with the same challenges of making ends meet in an expensive city. She'd studied international relations, human rights law, and conflict resolution. She'd written a thesis on humanitarian intervention in civil conflicts that had been published and cited by policymakers. She'd worked for NGOs in refugee camps during her summers, seeing firsthand the human cost of the policy debates that happened in comfortable conference rooms thousands of miles away. She'd built a reputation as someone who understood both the theory and practice of humanitarian work, someone who could navigate between academic analysis and practical implementation. When her country had achieved a democratic transition after decades of military rule, the new president had asked her to serve as ambassador for human rights and humanitarian affairs, a position created specifically for her, recognizing that her expertise and international credibility were assets the nation needed. She'd been 34 years old at her appointment, the youngest ambassador in her country's diplomatic corps, the first woman to hold her specific portfolio. She'd faced skepticism from colleagues who thought she was too young, too idealistic, too Western-educated to truly understand her own country's interests. But she'd proven herself in the 5 years since, building relationships across the international community, navigating complex negotiations, speaking truth about humanitarian crises even when it was diplomatically inconvenient. She'd earned respect from her peers, even those who'd initially doubted her. Yet here in an American airport she'd been treated like a potential threat because of how she looked and what she wore. The disconnect between her professional reality and how she was perceived by strangers was so vast it would be almost funny if it weren't so exhausting. The plane reached its cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign chimed off. Amara reopened her laptop and returned to work, revising her remarks for Geneva. She had 3 days of intensive meetings ahead, with other ambassadors, with UN officials, with humanitarian organizations working in crisis zones. She'd be photographed, quoted, scrutinized for every word and gesture. But for now on this flight she was just another passenger trying to get work done. And that, she thought, was exactly how she preferred it. The work mattered more than the recognition. The substance mattered more than the status. Several hours into the flight, after a meal service during which the flight attendants had been solicitous to the point of distraction, Amara got up to use the restroom. As she walked back to her seat, she passed through the economy cabin and noticed a teenage girl watching her with open curiosity and something that might have been recognition or hope. The girl was black, perhaps 15 or 16, traveling with what appeared to be her family, parents and a younger brother across the aisle. When Amara made eye contact instead of looking away, the girl smiled tentatively, as if testing whether engagement was welcome. Amara paused. "How's your flight going?" The girl's eyes widened slightly at being addressed directly by someone from business class. "It's good. I'm going to Paris for the first time. We're stopping there before we go visit family in Senegal." "That's wonderful. First time abroad?" "Yeah, I'm kind of nervous about it. Excited but nervous." Amara smiled, recognizing that mixture of emotions from her own first international trip decades earlier. "The nervousness means you're paying attention. That's good. The world is big and complicated, but it's worth seeing, every bit of it." She glanced at the girl's parents, who were watching the interaction with interest mixed with uncertainty, not sure who this woman from business class was or why she'd stopped to talk to their daughter. "Enjoy Paris. It's a beautiful city. And Senegal is special. Your family there will be happy to see you." "Thank you," the girl said, her smile widening. As Amara walked back to her seat, she thought about that girl, how she might have been watching Amara throughout the flight, trying to understand how someone who looked like her had ended up in business class while they were in economy. She hoped the girl would remember this moment, would hold on to it as evidence that the world contained more possibilities than it sometimes appeared to offer to young black women. She hoped the girl would remember that dignity and achievement didn't require designer clothes or expensive accessories. That substance mattered more than surface, that you could be exactly who you were without apology and still claim space in rooms that tried to exclude you. Back at her seat, Amara worked until her eyes grew tired, then reclined her seat and tried to rest. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by the ambient noise of the cabin and her own circling thoughts about the meetings ahead. The Geneva sessions would be difficult. There would be resistance to her proposals, Diplomatic maneuvering by nations who wanted to avoid scrutiny, carefully worded objections designed to paralyze action while appearing concerned. She would have to navigate all of it with precision, knowing that one misstep could undermine months of careful relationship building. She would have to be diplomat and advocate simultaneously, pushing for stronger protections while maintaining the relationships that made such advocacy possible. When the cabin lights came up for breakfast service several hours later, Amara was already awake, reviewing her notes one more time. The flight attendant brought her meal with the same attentive service, and Amara ate efficiently while continuing to work, maximizing every moment of productive time. As the plane began its descent into Geneva, the businessman across the aisle finally worked up the courage to speak to her directly. "I apologize if this is intrusive," he said, his tone suggesting he'd been rehearsing this opening for a while, "but I couldn't help noticing your briefing documents. Are you attending the Human Rights Council session?" Amara looked up from her laptop, her expression neutral. "I am. I'll be speaking on Wednesday." "On behalf of which organization?" His tone suggested he assumed she must be with an NGO, or perhaps support staff for a delegation. "My country." "Nigeria." His eyebrows rose in visible surprise. "You're with the Nigerian delegation?" "I lead it. I'm the ambassador for human rights and humanitarian affairs." He processed this information with visible effort, clearly reconciling her appearance with his preconceptions about what ambassadors should look like: older, probably male, certainly dressed in formal business attire rather than jeans and a sweatshirt. "That's impressive. You must be very accomplished to achieve such a position at your age." Amara gave him a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I try to be useful." He seemed to want to say more, seemed to be calculating whether to acknowledge his earlier misjudgment or pretend it hadn't happened. Amara saved him the awkwardness by returning to her laptop, signaling the end of the conversation, with body language he couldn't misread. The plane landed smoothly at Geneva Airport. As passengers began the familiar ritual of gathering belongings and crowding the aisles in their rush to deplane, despite having nowhere to actually go yet, Amara remained seated. She'd learned long ago that there was no benefit to rushing. The diplomatic lounge would wait. Her hotel would wait. The meetings wouldn't start until she arrived. When the aisle finally cleared, she stood, pulled her backpack from under the seat and made her way off the plane. The flight attendants thanked her by name as she passed. "Safe travels, Ambassador Okonkwo. We hope to see you again." Geneva Airport was smaller and more manageable than Dulles, but the diplomatic passport lane moved even more slowly, paradoxically, as Swiss immigration officers carefully verified credentials that required verification precisely because they granted special privileges. When Amara reached the immigration desk, she handed over her passport and watched the officer's face as they opened it and saw the diplomatic designation. The officer's demeanor shifted subtly but noticeably, more formal, more careful, aware that they were processing someone whose presence had diplomatic implications beyond simple tourism or business. "Welcome to Switzerland, Ambassador. Purpose of your visit? United Nations meetings, Human Rights Council session?" The officer stamped her passport with more care than they'd probably used for the previous 100 passengers, and returned it with both hands, a small gesture of respect. "Enjoy your stay, Ambassador." As Amara collected her passport and moved toward baggage claim, she thought about the contrast between her arrival at Dulles and her arrival in Geneva. Same passport, same person, different treatment. The variable wasn't her. It was whether people bothered to look beyond surface assumptions before forming judgments. She collected her small rolling suitcase from baggage claim. She'd learned to travel light, to live out of carry-on luggage whenever possible, though diplomatic travel sometimes required checking a bag for the formal attire expected at official functions. This trip required both, the casual clothes she preferred for actual work and the formal suits required for protocol events. Outside the terminal, a driver holding a sign with her name waited beside a black sedan with diplomatic plates. Her office had arranged the transport, as they always did for international trips. The driver greeted her formally in French-accented English, took her bags, and opened the door with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to transporting diplomats and dignitaries. As the car pulled away from the airport toward Geneva's diplomatic quarter, Amara looked out the window at the Swiss countryside, so orderly and prosperous compared to the places where her work usually focused. She thought about the refugee camps she'd visited, the crisis zones she'd toured, the people she'd met who carried trauma that would never fully heal. Those were the people she represented. Those were the stories she would tell in the meetings ahead. Not her own story of being briefly inconvenienced by airport security, but the stories of people facing real threats, real violations of their fundamental human rights. Her inconvenience was nothing compared to what they endured daily. Her phone buzzed with a message from her deputy. Car to hotel arranged, first briefing at 19 hours in your suite, document package waiting at reception, rest if you can. Amara typed back, "Thank you, see you at 7. The hotel was one of Geneva's finest, the kind of place where diplomats and international organization executives conducted informal negotiations over expensive meals in discreet private dining rooms. Amara checked in efficiently, declined offers of assistance with her minimal luggage, and made her way to her suite on one of the upper floors. The room was large and impersonal in the way of luxury hotels. Beautiful furniture, perfect cleanliness, no character. Elegant but sterile. She set her bags down, opened her laptop, and got back to work. There would be time to rest later. Right now there were briefings to review, talking points to finalize, strategic calculations to make about which battles to fight in the sessions ahead. At 7 o'clock sharp, her deputy chief of staff arrived with 2 policy advisors. They spread documents across the suite's dining table, briefing books, position papers, draft resolutions, intelligence summaries about other delegations' likely positions, and began the systematic review of everything that would happen over the next 3 days. Which sessions Amara would attend, which speakers she'd respond to, which bilateral meetings were scheduled, which ambassadors needed to be cultivated, which needed to be countered, which could be safely ignored. The briefing lasted 3 hours, covering every conceivable scenario and contingency. When her staff finally left, after confirming the morning schedule one more time and ensuring Amara had everything she needed, she ordered room service, a simple meal, nothing elaborate, and ate while reviewing her remarks one final time, making small adjustments to language and emphasis. She'd cut the section about accountability mechanisms. Too aggressive for the current diplomatic climate, her advisors had counseled, likely to trigger defensive responses that would derail the entire conversation. She'd strengthened the language about civilian protection. That was the hill worth dying on this session, the issue where she could push hard without losing support. At midnight, she finally allowed herself to sleep, setting an alarm for 6. The real work would begin tomorrow. If you've ever been misjudged based on your appearance, only to prove everyone's assumptions wrong, I'd like to hear about it in the comments below.